Hello and good morning. My name is Francine Harrigan and I'm with the United Nations Department of Public Information. We're very pleased to have you join us today for the launch of the United Nations World Population Prospects Report, the 27 revision. Today, to tell us about the report, I'm very pleased to welcome John Wilmoth, the Population Division Director in the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. John, if you'd like to come up to the podium to present the report, thank you.
Thank you, Francine, and good morning to all of you, and thank you for being here today. We hear frequently that people are at the center of sustainable development. And we know that, by definition, people are at the center of populations. Well, from these two simple observations, it follows that an understanding of population patterns and trends will be essential for the successful implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We can learn much by reviewing the diversity of demographic situations that exist in the world today. Some countries have large populations of children and youth, while some others have an abundance of people in the working age range. And in others, the population of older persons is growing rapidly. Each of these represents a distinct stage in a shared process of demographic transition, and each presents predictable challenges and opportunities that countries can expect to encounter along the path to sustainable development. In this context, we're very pleased to launch the 2017 revision of the World Population Prospects, which is the 25th round of official United Nations estimates and projections of the global population. The 2017 revision provides a comprehensive set of demographic data and indicators that can be used to assess population trends at the global, regional, and national levels, and to calculate other key indicators for use in monitoring progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, we are presenting a report based on these new data, entitled World Population Prospects, the 2017 Revision, Key Findings and Advanced Tables. The report provides an initial summary of the key demographic changes that are occurring around the world. This is the report. The associated data set includes information on the populations of 233 countries or areas of the world, whose populations together comprise the global population. According to the results of the 2017 revision, the world's population numbered nearly 7.6 billion in mid-2017, having grown by 1 billion people since 2005 and by 2 billion since 1993. These latest projections indicate that the world will have around 8.6 billion people in 2030 and 9.8 billion in 2050. Keeping in mind that population projections farther into the future are increasingly uncertain, the medium variant projection foresees a world population of 11.2 billion people in 2100. The statistical model that underlies these projections indicates that we can expect with a high degree of certainty that the global population will be between 8.4 and 8.7 billion in 2030, between 9.4 and 10.2 billion in 2050, and between 9.6 and 13.2 billion in 2100. Population growth will not occur evenly around the world. In fact, it will be concentrated in certain regions. The population of Africa is notable for its rapid pace of growth, and it is anticipated that over half of global population growth between now and 2050 will take place in that region. At the other extreme, it is expected that the population of Europe will, in fact, decline somewhat in the coming decades. Future population trends will be affected by trajectories in the three major components of change fertility, mortality, and migration, but especially by the future course of fertility. For the world as a whole, fertility has fallen steadily since the 1960s. In the period between 2010 and 2015, the world's women had 2.5 births per woman over a lifetime. But this number varies widely around the world. Amongst the different regions, Europe has the lowest fertility level, estimated at 1.6 births per woman in the most recent period, while Africa has the highest fertility, with around 4.7 births per woman. Even assuming a continued decline in fertility, given this relatively high starting point, we should anticipate a continued rapid growth of the African population, which will roughly double in size between now and 2050. Fertility levels in the other world regions are in an intermediate range between those of Africa and Europe. When fertility falls below the threshold of 2.1 births per woman, the number of babies that arrives from year to year is insufficient to replace the parent's generation, creating a situation known as below replacement fertility. Between 2010 and 2015, 46% of the world's population lived in 83 countries where the fertility level was below this threshold of 2.1. Such low levels of fertility have been present in countries of Europe and North America for several decades. More recently, fertility below the replacement level has been observed also for 19 countries in Asia, 15 in Latin America and the Caribbean, and 3 in Oceania and 2 in Africa. The latest projections are based on an assumption that in the long run, fertility will converge to levels around or slightly below the replacement level of 2.1 births per woman. Thus, for the medium variant projection, it is assumed that fertility will continue to decline in countries or regions where fertility remains above that level, and to increase at least slightly in countries or regions where fertility is now at much lower levels. Over the long run, the historic decline of mortality and fertility is fundamentally reshaping the age distribution of the human population. At the global level, the population distribution by sex and age looked something like a pyramid in the 1950s, with a wide base representing children and youth. By 2017, the base had narrowed considerably, reflecting the declining proportion of young people in the global population. According to the medium variant projection, the age distribution of the world's population in 2050 will more closely resemble a rocket than a pyramid. At that point, the population will be spread out much more evenly across the age range, with increasing numbers of survivors to very old ages. Among the world's regions today, Africa has the youngest population, as reflected in the relatively wide base of its population pyramid. In 2017, 60% of the African population In 2017, 60% of the African population is under the age of 25, with only 5% at ages 60 or higher. In Europe, on the other hand, the process of population aging is already well advanced, with roughly a quarter of the population under age 25 and another quarter age 60 or older. The age distribution for other parts of the world falls in between these two extremes. At each stage of the transition from younger to older populations, countries face both challenges and opportunities. Developing countries with youthful and rapidly growing populations face the considerable challenge of providing health care, education, and employment opportunities for ever-increasing numbers of children and youth. Despite these challenges, such countries can look forward to an important opportunity in the middle stage of this transition. For a country that has been growing rapidly, a sustained reduction in the fertility level will lead within a few decades to a population that is highly concentrated in the working age range. This swelling of the working age population is a temporary phenomenon that will soon be overtaken by the increase of population at older ages. While it lasts, however, the favorable age distribution can facilitate a more rapid growth of income per capita, helping to lift people out of poverty and into a more prosperous future. On the other hand, in countries with rapidly growing older populations, the upward shift in the age distribution challenges the sustainability of social protection systems, especially old age pension and healthcare systems, due to a decreasing ratio of workers to retirees. Available policy responses include measures to enlarge the size of the labor force, including through the increased participation of women, and to raise the productivity of individual workers. Other approaches include increasing the official retirement age and encouraging personal savings. Life expectancy at birth and other measures of mortality are important indicators of the health and well-being of populations. The 2017 revision confirms that substantial improvements in life expectancy have occurred in recent years. Globally, life expectancy at birth rose by almost 4 years, or from 67 to 71 years, from the period between 2000 and 2005 until the period between 2010 and 2015. Although all regions shared in the gains made over those years, the largest increase was for Africa, where life expectancy at birth rose by almost 7 years in the same interval, after rising by only 2 years in the previous decade. Despite these gains, large inequalities in life expectancy persist between poorer and richer areas of the world. Life expectancy in Africa stood at 60 years in the period between 2010 and 2015, compared to 79 years in Northern America. Like fertility, there is a considerable diversity in levels and trends of life expectancy at birth across countries and regions. Life expectancy now exceeds 80 years in some high-income countries, whereas for several African countries it remains around 50 years. Globally, life expectancy for both sexes combined is projected to rise to around 77 years in the period between 2045 and 2050, and eventually to 83 years in the period between 2095 and 2100. Although differences in life expectancy across regions are projected to persist in future years, such differences are expected to diminish somewhat between now and 2050. Migration is the third component of demographic change, along with fertility and mortality. The migration estimates from the 2017 revision refer to net international migration, which is the difference between the number of immigrants and the number of emigrants for an individual country or for a group of countries. Between 1950 and 2015, the regions of Europe, Northern America, and Oceania were net receivers of international migrants, while Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean were net senders. For most of this period, the volume of the net flows of migrants between these large regions increased over time. The latest estimates indicate that the annual net movement of persons between major regions of the world increased steadily up through the period between 2005 and 2010. For the decade between 2000 and 2010, the combined net inflows of migrants to Europe, to Northern America, and to Oceania reached 3.1 million persons per year. During the period from 2010 to 2015, however, net flows of migrants between major regions of the world diminished. This contraction was most noticeable regarding the net inflow to Europe and the net outflows from Asia and from Latin America and the Caribbean. In most situations, the influence of international migration on the population dynamics of a country is much smaller than the impact due to the balance between births and deaths. Today, however, in some countries with low levels of fertility and aging populations, where the number of deaths roughly equals, and in some cases even exceeds the number of births, a net inflow of migrants has been the primary source of population growth, and in some cases has averted a decline in population size. Also, since the age distribution of migrants is typically youthful, positive levels of net migration tend to boost the shares of the working age population and of children and youth relative to the population at older ages. However, international migration at levels previously observed or that seem possible for the future would provide only a partial counterweight to the long-term upward shift in the population age distribution. Before closing, I invite you to visit the website of the Population Division, as shown here, where you will find a wealth of detailed information about populations at the national, regional, and global levels. In the coming weeks and months, more information will be added to this website. Please note that selected demographic indicators referring to individual countries or areas and to large regions of the world have been included in the key findings and advanced tables of the 2017 revision, which is available here in hard copy at the back of the room, as well as online at the Population Division's website. I wish to close by acknowledging the many persons and institutions whose contributions have made it possible to share these data with you here today. The Population Division wishes to thank the national statistical offices of all countries for their work in gathering and processing the underlying information and sharing them with the United Nations. We also thank the Statistics Division, our sister division within DESA, for their work in collating and disseminating the data received from national statistical offices and other sources. Lastly, I wish to thank the staff members of the Population Division who have worked for more than a year to organize and assess the quality of input data coming from multiple sources, and then to derive global estimates and projections, and finally to package and present the resulting information and indicators as part of the materials being shared today and in the coming weeks and months. Thanks also to all of you for your attention and interest, and at this point, I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We'll now open the floor to questions, but first, if I could ask our colleague Francois to join us up here. Francois Pelletier is the chief of the Estimates and Projections section in DESA. If I can ask if there are any questions from the floor, please.
Thank you for the briefing. I'm Rosalind Jordan with Al Jazeera English on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association. Thank you for this updated report. I know that you don't deal with policy per se, but in light of the SDGs, do numbers such as the fact that some parts of the world have increasingly younger populations in need of education, should there be more of a focus on work opportunity, educational opportunity, environmental programs to help develop those countries? And might it be possible to have persons who are older from other parts of the world perhaps move to places that are younger and more vibrant? Might it actually be a way of promoting sustainability from the ground up rather than having people move in the other direction? Thank you.
Good questions. Thank you. The second part is an interesting framing, I must say. But let's start with the first part of your question, which was, what does this imply in terms of how government should react? And you asked specifically about the situation of developing countries which are faced with, some of them faced still with rapid increase of their population and large cohorts of young people. I think clearly the demographic situation in those countries suggests that governments need to pay heightened attention to the issues that you mentioned, in particular education and health care for younger persons, of course, across the age range, but in particular education and health care to develop the human capacities of the population, and but also giving some attention to issues of decent work and job opportunities for when the large cohorts of young people reach the working age range. And this, if the right circumstances are there, those countries can in fact benefit from the fact that they have this currently large cohort of young people. That there's a real opportunity there if that is treated as a resource and developed properly. Of course, fundamentally that's done to respect the rights of those people, but ultimately that also is of great benefit to the population as a whole. And it creates this opportunity for what we call a demographic dividend when there's this period of time over the course of this transition when the working age population tends to be unusually large before population aging advances very far, which creates a kind of opportunity for rapid growth and development. But it requires, as you were suggesting, the investment upfront in the capacities of young people. Your second question, frankly, I've never heard this. This is an interesting idea that should older persons move toward younger populations rather than younger people moving toward the older populations? I have never thought about this as a. Is this viable in some way? I think migrants have always tended to be younger on average. They've tended to be young adults who are ready and eager to work, and there's something perhaps natural about that tendency to move at younger ages rather than at older ages. We do have a situation in some countries where older people move toward more friendly climates within countries or across countries. But as far as a general pattern, of course, the movement has been from large populations that have relatively younger age structures toward populations that are growing more slowly that have older age structures. So I think maybe that's the more either of these directions of movement, as you're proposing, could somehow rebalance the demographic situation or kind of even things out somewhat. But I think one is much more practical than the other.
And then to follow up on that, in terms of urban planning, trying to decide how to build housing and business centers in the developing countries, should policymakers be looking more at how to maybe be more innovative in developing countries, given that they have young people who are prepared to do the work, prepared to do the education in order to build societies from the ground up, rather than moving to places where these sorts of innovations have already been baked in?
I think this is clearly the goal. When we talk about international migration, you have one extreme, which is people being forced to move, and then you have other situations where people move for opportunity in other countries, and they move voluntarily, but for other opportunities. Our goal should really be to create a situation in which everyone has an option of staying in their own country and prospering and thriving in that country. So what you're describing is, it's always a better strategy, it seems, to focus on exploiting the capacity of the young population in the home country rather than sending them abroad. Of course, there are advantages related to remittances that migrants send home to developing countries, and these are quite important for development. But certainly the long-run goal is a situation in which everyone has a possibility to thrive and be successful in their home country without moving.
Thank you. I'll take the question here.
I'm Mario Villar with FF from Spain. I wanted to ask you if you could expand a bit more in the role that migration has in these projections. Like looking at the tables, for example, countries like the US, where you expect an important growth of the population, at the same time have a decline in fertility rate. How do you account for all this migration movements, and do you take into account policy changes, projections on how these trends are going to evolve?
Mm-hmm. Well, of the different components of population change, birth, death, and migration, I would say that migration is the most difficult to anticipate. With fertility and mortality, both of them are highly structured by age and by biology. Migration is also structured by age, but it's more of a social choice than biological phenomenon. And it's really notoriously difficult to make assumptions about future trends in migration. And the assumptions that are used by the population division in making these projections are first to assess the current levels or recent levels of migration in recent years, and to assume that those will be maintained at a similar level over the next few decades until at a certain point they start to taper off towards zero, because only in the very long run, though. They don't. You want to expand on this, explain exactly what we assume on that?
Yes, thank you. For the projections of migration, yes, we look at the past estimates that were generated across different countries in order to reproduce the populations over time and take into account the migration data that are provided. We have to bear in mind that in doing so, the world needs to balance to zero. So there are some adjustments that are made at one point. Overall, for the projections, we assume a fairly constant level of the total number of migrants until 2050. And from 2050 to 2100, we assume a 50% decline or increase. It goes back to a 50% reduction. Indeed, as John was saying, the migration is the most difficult component to project. We'd also look at the quotas that governments are put in place for some countries. Not all countries provide that information. And we look at the projections that are done by some countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the floor? Matthew?
Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks for the briefing. I just wanted, and I'm sorry if I'm trying to cover the Council, Security Council as well. When you say revision, how much have you changed your previous projections, if you can't say that? And what's kind of the margin of error on the numbers that you're putting out for the various time frames? And I'm compelled to ask this, I would assume that you would know that there was a DESA official, Mr. Rashid, who was indicted yesterday for abuse, various forms of abuse in terms of a domestic worker. And I wanted to know from you, as the DESA official that's here, what did he work in? It wasn't a little. The press reporting didn't make it clear. And what do you think of it? What's your statement on it, given the issues that we're discussing? Thank you.
Well, to take the first question first, this is an update. A revision is sometimes a revision sometimes involves major changes based on new understandings, new data that kind of change our understanding of the trends. I would say that this revision is not of that nature. This is mostly an update of information. Maybe Mr. Pelletier could expand a little bit on what is new. But since population trends are fairly stable over time, they're highly predictable. The normal situation is that they don't change that much over a 2-year period, and each revision is quite similar to the one in the past. And in fact, I think there were relatively small changes in terms of projections of total population and so forth. It's quite similar to the revision of 2 years ago. So you may recall back in 2013 when we released new data, it was at a point where there were new understandings based on data that had been, the preponderance of evidence was changing our understanding regarding trends of fertility in Africa. And we revised upward our estimates and projections of fertility levels in Africa, which affected global population projections. There's nothing like that this time. There's no real change in understanding based on new information that's been coming to light, but maybe with some exceptions that Francois could expand on.
Thank you. Indeed, in this revision, there were no major revision in the projection methodology. I would say the major changes were in the estimates of specific countries. I could name a few: Equatorial Guinea, Angola, Qatar. Some of these countries, based on new information that was made available, were either, indeed the ones I named were increased, but there are other countries that were reduced. In terms of the projection methodology, we did make some modifications in the approach to project the life expectancy at birth. So the results are a bit different in that area. However, in terms of the impact on population, that is fairly minimal. So in terms of population, in 2100, we have a very similar population for the world level as we did in the last revision. Africa is slightly higher. Survival prospects have improved, I would say, to a higher degree in southern Africa, because we also made some modifications in the estimation and projection of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Matthew, regarding your other question, I have no information on it. I'm sorry.
You know, I mean, do you know it?
I think on that, Matthew, given
don't- I
the
don't
scope
know.
of this press briefing, maybe that's a more pertinent question for the noon briefing.
Okay.
Are there more questions on the population report, please?
Sure, just one final question. The idea that half of the world's population will soon be concentrated in 9 countries, were you able to identify any factors why that might be?
So in 9 countries? You want to explain?
Actually, it's the 50% of the growth will be concentrated in 9 countries, not
Overall.
50% of the total population.
But still the question, is there any particular reason why in these 9 countries, are there any common factors?
Well, several of them are fairly large countries. Some have, their fertility is going down, but in some of them the fertility is still fairly high. And then there's the momentum effect in some of them where the fertility has already been reduced to some degree, but with the momentum and the size of their sheer population, they represent a large contribution to the overall growth.
Thank you. And with that, we'll have to wrap up today's press briefing. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today and for our panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you.